Aloha, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here. And I have to say that's a tough act to follow, that last girl. I'm going to talk to you today about local investing and how it can rebuild the economy one community at a time. But first, I want to ask you to think about a question. What would the world look like if we invested, each and every one of us, 50% of our investment dollars within 50 miles of where we live? Would we have the same high unemployment, or might more people be working if money had been invested locally rather than chasing profit around the globe? Would we have the same urban decay in once vital cities and rural decline across so much of the country? Or might we have thriving main streets and downtowns with diversified economies and healthy tax revenues? And here in Hawaii, where roughly 90% of the food and energy is imported, maybe there would be local companies producing these things so Hawaii could be more self-sufficient. So I first heard that question about investing within 50 miles in the fall of 2009 when I was early into the research on my book. It was posed by Woody Tash, the founder of Slow Money, which is a grassroots organization working to fund local sustainable food and agriculture. Well, 50% might be a pipe dream, but it got me to thinking about the massive imbalance that exists today in our financial system, because the fact is, most of us invest nothing in local companies. Collectively, we have $30 trillion invested in 401ks, mutual funds, and pension funds and the like. Most of that, almost all of that, goes to large publicly traded corporations, often the very same ones that are outsourcing jobs, dodging their taxes, and paying their CEOs ungodly sums while they squeeze their workers. Whoops, getting ahead now. So why this imbalance? A large reason is our securities laws, which were put into place in the Great Depression and haven't changed much since. I'm not going to go into detail about them because, believe me, they'll make your head spin. But the bottom line is that today it's easier for most Americans to invest in a company halfway around the world than one in their own backyard. Well, and that's truly a shame because local investing is our best hope to rebuild an economy that's been hollowed out by years of globalization and neglect. Without strong local economies, we can't have a strong national or global economy. So quickly, what do I mean by local? Local companies can be mom and pop shops, they can be startups, they can be companies that employ hundreds of people. The key is that they're locally owned and rooted in their communities. They're stakeholders. And this actually describes most of the nation's 27 million small businesses. And why do these companies matter? Well, small businesses create 2 out of every 3 jobs and employ half the private workforce. Multinationals, on the other hand, are net job destroyers. They employ a lot of people, but they eliminate many more jobs than they create, at least in this country. And beyond that, local companies add to the character and the identity of our communities. They make them places where we want to live. They promote regional diversity and truly competitive markets, rather than monoculture and monopolies. So we should be supporting these companies, not starving them. And that's why it's been so exciting to see this local investment movement building over the last few years, this flowering of citizen finance. And as I was working on my book, I talked to many, many communities across the country that are figuring out how to do that, all within the narrow openings of today's securities laws. and I'm going to share just a few examples with you. My first is about the cops in Clare, Michigan, that saved their town's 111-year-old bakery and revitalized their downtown in the process. Well, one morning, Officer Greg Reinerson, and that's him on the right, was out on patrol when he heard some alarming news. The Clare City Bakery was going to close for good. Well, not only was his bakery a fixture of his youth, but if it closed, it would be yet another shuttered storefront in downtown Clare, which, like many Michigan towns, had been hit hard by the struggling auto industry. So back at the headquarters over lunch, he convinced 8 fellow officers, and that would be the entire Clare police force, to chip in and buy the bakery. Now, these guys are very clever, so the first thing they did was to rename the bakery Cops and Donuts. Because everybody knows how much cops love their donuts, right? And I said they were clever, so they also tweaked the menu, adding the squealer, a maple glazed donut topped with 2 strips of bacon. And they added a line of merchandise, including T-shirts with slogans reading, DWI, donuts were involved. And my absolute favorite, don't glaze me, bro. So the bakery became an overnight success, drawing people from all over. And today, it employs more full-time people than the entire Clare police and fire departments combined. And that success has spilled over to other merchants on their main street. So instead of more vacancies, new stores are opening up. And there's another way that the cops have helped their community. Like many small businesses, they buy as much as they can locally. So their coffee is roasted in town, their T-shirts are printed nearby, and their flour comes from a family-run Michigan supplier. They also support local charities, and they sponsor a T-ball team called the Little Donut Holes. But this is what local companies do. Okay, my next example comes from Fort Greene, Brooklyn, and this is just a 10-minute walk from where I live. It's a great neighborhood, lots of brownstones, really creative people live there, but the one thing they didn't have was a bookstore to call their own. So when 2 women decided they were going to open a bookstore, people were thrilled. In fact, they were so thrilled that when the women couldn't get a bank loan they needed, about 24 neighbors stepped up and lent them $70,000 in return for a modest interest rate and a discount on books. So 2 years later, the Greenlight Bookstore is thriving and defying all the gloom and doom predictions about independent bookstores. And it's become an integral part of its neighborhood, holding frequent events like this one with the local author Jonathan Lethem. And the best part is that its lenders have become its very best customers. Another example comes from Port Townsend, Washington, about 40 miles north of Seattle. Now, this was once an important shipping center, but more recently, its population and its prospects have dwindled. So, in an effort to reverse that trend, a number of residents began lending money to local businesses. They decided to formalize that relationship, and they created the Local Investing Opportunities Network, or LION for short. Well, to date, LION members have invested almost $1 million in a number of companies, including a bike shop, a real estate project, an organic cidery, and a cheesemaker. And inspired by what the people of Port Townsend have done, other communities now are creating lions of their own, such as Madison, Wisconsin, and New York City. And I want to mention that one of the original Lion members, James Frazier, has moved to Maui, and he's in the audience today. And finally, I want to share a story about Saranac Lake, New York, a beautiful, picturesque little town in the Adirondacks. Well, several years ago, their only department store went out of business after its parent company took on too much debt and went bankrupt. Well, that left people facing an hour drive each way to get basic items like underwear and sheets that weren't readily available in town. So at first, they tried to attract other retailers into the area, but the only one that was interested was Walmart, which wanted to come in and build a supercenter. Well, many people feared that a supercenter would overwhelm their small village and put their local merchants out of business. So they decided to create their own store. They put together a business plan and started selling shares through what is known as a direct public offering. So that's like an IPO, but without the help or the hefty fees of a Wall Street bank. And because they limited this offering to residents of New York State, they were exempt from federal securities laws. So it took a few years, but they raised more than $500,000, and this past October opened the Saranac Lake Community Store. I like to think of it as the retail equivalent of the Green Bay Packers, a department store that's not going to pick up and leave when a better offer comes along or when its parent company runs into trouble. So these are just a few examples, but I hope they begin to show the power of local investing to revitalize communities. There's one problem with this type of investing, and that is liquidity. How do you get your money out when you need it? And that's where the concept of a local stock exchange comes in. Many people don't realize, but we once had dozens of stock exchanges across the country that fueled the growth of their local economies, from Wheeling, West Virginia, to Boulder, Colorado, to right here in Hawaii. This is a picture of the old Honolulu Stock Exchange, which raised capital for local companies like Bank of Hawaii, Maui Telephone, and Honolulu Rapid Transit. Well, eventually, communications technology made these physical exchanges less important, and trading siphoned off to the New York Stock Exchange. And one by one, they went out of business or they merged. So today, our markets are global and efficient, but they're no longer serving the types of regional growth companies that they once did. So it's against this backdrop that the idea of the local stock exchange is being revived. And there are efforts underway to do that in Pennsylvania, in Tennessee, in California, and right here in Hawaii. Now, Hawaii, as we all know, is blessed with abundant natural resources, yet you import so much of your food and energy. Hawaii is also rich in financial capital, but much of that is invested on the mainland. So a Hawaii stock exchange would help keep more of that capital local, so it could be used to fund companies that can help Hawaii lessen its dependence on imports. Companies like Pacific Biodiesel and the Haile Maile Pineapple Company. And there are also some people working on the Hawaii Stock Exchange here today, including David Fisher from Maui Ventures. And they face a lot of challenges in trying to get something like this done, not the least of which is regulatory. But there's some really good news here to report. This may soon, all of this, local stock exchanges, local investing, may soon become much easier There's legislation making its way through Congress that would loosen some of these restrictions that prevent us all from investing in our local companies. The Entrepreneur Access to Capital Act passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan support. There are similar bills in the Senate, and some people expect a bill like this to pass as early as this spring. And that would be great. That would open up huge opportunities for local investing and bring it into the mainstream. So someday, instead of putting your money in the S&P 500, maybe you could put it in the Maui 50. So I started off by asking you to think about that question of what would it be like if we all invested 50% of our money within 50 miles of where we live? Well, I mean, let's face it, we'll probably never get to 50%, but what about 10% or 5% or even 1%? 1% of that $30 trillion that Americans have in long-term investments is $300 billion. To put that in perspective, that's roughly half of all of the small business bank loans outstanding today. Imagine the transformative impact of $300 billion on the Main Street economy, on companies like Cops and Donuts and Greenlight Bookstore and Pacific Biodiesel. These are the companies that create jobs and healthy communities. These are the companies that we should be investing in. And this is the way we can rebuild the economy from the ground up, one community at a time. Mahalo.